Hey guys, I was gonna wait until my second viewing of Ivan's edit so I could give my full thoughts, but I'm not really sure when that's gonna happen, so figured I'd just give you my first impressions. Second video should be coming with more specific critiques, but here you go. Get off your high horse, Ivan. Stuff like this isn't gonna bring the fan base together. It does more to cause divisiveness than any decision Lucasfilm has made in the Disney era. Stop saying you don't understand Star Wars or they don't really care about Star Wars, and realize that we just value different aspects of it. Most of the things you added were unmotivated and so jarringly forced in that I'm not even sure how you define what's good and what's bad. Sure, I would have removed a lot of the same fluff you did, but you cut out many of the vital moments that give the characters an actual reason to be in the movie, and it's just shallow. It seems to me that you value the more science fiction-y aspects of Star Wars, or at least that you have gripes when things aren't explained with scientific jargon. And that's fine, I love science fiction and there is value in that airtight structure. But I would argue that what made Star Wars in 1977 was that the story and world building were aggressively unscience fiction. It stood apart from its era because it takes place so long ago and so far away that the how doesn't matter. There's just glowy swords and space wizards and a mystical energy field. Sure, there are some sciencey words being thrown around sometimes, but space was just the setting. The essence was in its fantasy storytelling. The old EU offered a more sci-fi interpretation of the Star Wars universe, as does the Clone Wars and some other canon material, but the closest the movies ever get to that is midi-chlorians, which gets semi-retconned. The explanations of the Force throughout Star Wars evolve from that into something much more mystical. It literally moves from science fiction to fantasy. It's a beautiful arc that transcends everything else. The Force Awakens attempts to continue that arc, but had other expectations to fulfill. So it set up Episode 8 to convey the deepest understanding of the Force that we've seen, and Rian Johnson executed it masterfully. The progression that Luke goes through is an essential vessel for the continuation of that larger arc, and it just can't be removed. Ivan, you sacrifice the most meaningful and interesting aspect of the Disney-era films for a Rocky training montage. Cutting the most insightful lines of dialogue makes it seem like you're just not looking that hard to find the value in The Last Jedi. Now, I know that recycling footage doesn't give you a whole lot to work with, but several techniques you used felt extremely forced in. You seemed so confident that you could easily fix certain plot holes with just a line of dialogue, but that's just so obviously not true. They were cheap, meaningless, distracting, and petty. Even if they were good lines included in the original cut, I would have rolled my eyes in the theater because they don't need to be there. The gravity in the bombers is actually conveyed visually. Adding in dialogue to explain how they work is just dumbing the movie down for the audience. The Leia flying scene was definitely on my list of things I would change in my theoretical fan edit, and you did that well enough with the footage you had. I believe the major thing you had a problem with, though, was that she could use the Force without Jedi training, and that's a subjective issue we disagree on. Sure, using the Force to get heroes out of bad situations can be lazy writing, but this scene deliberately goes out of its way to introduce a new idea, and I appreciate that. I don't understand why the Jedi training is so important to some. Rey's power is very well explained, and not necessarily any greater than a trained Jedi just because the cinematography is more flashy. How the Force works in regular folks is a unique point that Disney is trying to make. I'll concede that it's not something that was directly approached until The Force Awakens, so it may not be Star Wars for some people, but Rian Johnson didn't come up with that idea, so don't say he ruined that aspect of your Star Wars. It's present in The Force Awakens and potent in Rogue One. I'm not even sure what there is to ruin. I don't find anything interesting about keeping the Force totally exclusive to such a microscopic group of people. New abilities, new philosophy, that's what makes the Disney era interesting. Removing much of Luke's explanation of the Force and Leia's power heavily weakens the only layer that could actually make the sequel trilogy innovative. And it was replaced with this balance between light and darkness nonsense. Sure, there's an interesting idea in there that I agree with, but what do you mean? There's no depth, nothing philosophically provoking in the dialogue you added. This is a far worse betrayal of Luke than the original cut because he's unmotivated and doesn't contribute anything interesting. Sure, I also would have loved a more concrete reason for his retreat to the island, but the new Jedi need to permanently learn from the mistakes highlighted in the prequel trilogy. Luke's arc brings that theme full circle, and removing it removes the most important function of the sequel trilogy. If you just want the sequels to have never happened, I understand why, but there is an entire layer to the Star Wars canon that is beautiful and finally being brought to the forefront, and you're missing out on it.